so much about consistency as being one of the things that's an absolute need in this supply chain. And that goes for sourcing, for efficacy, for effect. If this industry doesn't find that, it's going to be a big issue. And we're going to call next on Will Kleidon from Ojai Energetics to go into the ways that manufacturers and brands and suppliers and investors should identify best practices in the ingredient space, in the extraction space, when thinking about what's going to work in their products. Now, Will's going to talk science, and you might think it's going to be sort of a dry portion of the show, but you haven't met Will yet. Now, this is going to be a big topic, and there are going to be a lot of questions, so we're going to try and circulate the mic afterwards and get to as many as we possibly can. But let's bring him on. Will Kleidon.
Thank you, sir. Greetings. I'm Will Kleidon, and excited to be here. So, talking about the best scientific practices for cannabis in food and beverage, which is a broad topic. I'm going to go through the scaffolding of from soil to finished goods, and then really open it up for you guys to rapid fire at me, because that's where you're going to get your most bang for buck. I love questions. So, great. So we're going to go from farming, extraction, sourcing, and formulating. So starting with the soil, right? It's absolutely vital. As cannabis is a dynamic accumulator. So what that means is it pulls metals as well as nutrients from deep into the soil and brings it to the surface as well as into the plant. It's great for cleaning up radioactive waste, and it's also really vital not to eat hemp that was used to clean up dirty soil. So there are, you really need to look at the quality of the soil, particularly with heavy metals, less so of a risk with radioactive waste unless you're sourcing from Chernobyl, which they're actually utilizing hemp to clean up. But particularly in China, there's a lot of high heavy metal hemp products coming into the market, although that was pre-Farm Bill. Now domestic supply chain is pretty predominant in the US. People want clean cannabis, particularly out of all products. You're seeing the market driving purity and cleanness as a vital touching point, and you see this with legislation demanding that there's herbicides and pesticide testings for the final product. Hopefully that will lead into tomatoes and potatoes for people, but it's catalyzing the way for that. And then also you got to know your farmers, because they're the ones who know what's in the soil, unless you're looking at the end of it. But from the full supply chain of, if you're buying it, you got to know the people who are growing it to really know what's going into the plant, as well as terroir and the terpenes. So cannabis is one of the most diverse terpene-producing plants, and terpenes are essential oils, and they're what gives smell and flavor. And they're actually they do a lot more than that. We think of them as being smelly, but in reality, the difference between a strain that makes someone completely sedated and couch-locked versus one that is cerebral is the terpenes. So the minor cannabinoids are really quite minor in how they impact the body, and it's really all about the terps in terms of how the cannabinoids go in the body and where they go to. So they're basically like little tugboats, and they direct the cannabinoids to the different receptors that they're going towards and deposit the cannabinoids there. And so the terpenes will vary from season to season, just like grapes and wine. And so when you're starting to standardize products, you really want to, that's an important piece to look at is terpene variants in your final products, and that starts with the soil. This at the bottom is photos of our R&D farm. It's a biodynamic farm. And you can see the roots. That's a tiny, tiny plant, but the roots actually go up to 100 feet down. So they'll mine up the nutrients. So it's really important to start with clean soil. We deployed a Korean-style farming method with nutrients and had zero input into our farm this year, other than the topsoil, and limited application, did not use pesticides or herbicides. Will be certified organic. That's our farm, and you can see we're doing biodynamic methods and cover cropping. So we're actually sequestering CO2 and mitigating the need with different plants that attract beneficial pollinators and predatory wasps to not bring in pesticides and herbicides, which you do not want in your final products. And that's some of the flower that came from this year's crop that we're breeding. So we've got about 30 different strains with different terpenes and cannabinoids that we're going to launch out for various projects. But that hemp, that's legally hemp, right? And that's different from what a lot of people imagine hemp to look like. People are imagining long, tall stalks and stems. There was a lot of myth, and thankfully it's been mostly dispelled, but people initially thought that CBD or cannabinoids from hemp were inferior to cannabis. That's absolutely not the case. You can have terrible quality high THC plants, just like you can have terrible quality hemp plants for CBD production. And it's actually a legal definition, not a botanical definition. So as long as the plant is grown in compliance with the Farm Bill, any cannabis plant whose THC is below 0.3 is legally hemp. And so that affects the quality of the extract in the final product as well. All right, so extraction. There's really three main extraction methods. There's actually a lot more, but there's three primary ones that you'll run into. You've got ethanol at the top, CO2, and no, photo's not quite right, but then you can do butane. So butane extraction, heavy in the high THC cannabinoid space. As long as you purge it out, it's safe. If you don't, it's not. As is the same for ethanol. For cannabis, you need to purge it properly. The first photo is a crude extract where there's more phytonutrients, waxes, chlorophyll, and enzymes. And then you can purify it to the next level, which would be winterizing. So that's using ethanol to pull out the waxes. It makes it easier for formulation. You lose some of these micronutrients and compounds in doing that. And then the final distillate, which looks like a combination between that far right slab of ice looking thing next to the yellow one, and that's a distillate. And so that is high concentration. Now you can take that and you can actually remove the THC from it, so you can have a broad spectrum of cannabinoids and terpenes, which are really vital for efficacy without any THC. Now THC is actually really important for overall benefit, but in some cases you want to have it completely removed. And safety is really important, and so we're finding in the industry that there's isolate showing up that has high amounts of hexane present, and then we're actually finding paint remover in the product now, which is extremely dangerous for consumption. And there's a lot of people, so that photo, the green jar, is made in someone's kitchen. So there's people supplying product that they make in their bathtub, and it's rampant. So it's really important when you're doing an extraction method, one, that it's ISO, right? And through GMP, y'all know that. But a lot of people in this industry don't know that, and it is a green rush. And so you've got a lot of sources that don't know, they're just distributing or reselling, and they don't know where they're getting it, including in this isolate case with this paint remover. They can't pinpoint. They know the people distributing it, but they're not giving up who it is. And so you really need to be diligent, and the industry needs to be diligent in establishing protocol, just like any other compound, because it's a vegetable in essence. Right, so sourcing. So can they scale is really important, because you've got companies who are producing 20 kilo batches, and if you go with them and all of a sudden you hit a spike in growth, you fall flat if you can't continue to supply. With the terpenes and terroir that we were talking about, if you switch suppliers, you're going to get a change in terpenes, and the customers will notice it. So that's very important. Also, you got to ask what their certifications are. Are they ISO, GMP? Many are not. Thankfully, the industry is getting better. And then always use third-party batch testing, because and get that from the outside. You only want to go with someone who uses third-party testing, as well as you want to test it yourself, because they can take a lot test and they can flip it. And so you want to find a good third-party lab that's testing not just for the cannabinoid content, but also for the VOCs, the terpenes, the pesticides, the herbicides, and the heavy metals. Because a lot of companies will just show you that page, and that's showing the cannabinoid content, but they're not showing you the heavy metals, and they're not showing you the VOCs, and they're not showing you the pesticides and herbicides. So that's a really important question to ask. All right, formulating. So how to make a winning product. You need something, if it's a beverage, you want to address the issue of solubility, right? Now, there's multiple methods to do it. You can take an isolate compound and you can nanosize it, and that will go into the beverage. Now, there's multiple issues with isolate. It's kind of sexy from a formulating standpoint, but when it actually comes to the reality of the future play, as well as the efficacy, it really falls flat for a number of reasons. And then you can make a synthetic encapsulation. So basically cannabis oil, and I'm sure some of you are aware that the different oils have different properties, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all compound to actually create a stable emulsion or encapsulation. And so for cannabis, a certified organic sunflower lecithin or any lecithin will not really create a fully stable emulsion. And a modified lecithin will, and that will make a liposome, but it will never be certified organic. In the trends of the industry, people want clean and organic. And with that, you've got if you do a liposome, which is, you can see at the bottom, it's about a 15-minute onset for the user, 15 to 20 minutes. And then the colloidal, you can use a petroleum-derived compound at nanoscale to make a colloidal, which is the best way to deliver cannabinoids, which are fat-soluble. And that has a very rapid onset. It's about a 30-second onset. The bioavailability skyrockets, which enables you to put a very low loading dose in for efficacious outcome. Now, we figured out and cracked the code back in 2014. I met a chemist, and he had figured out a solubility method. I said, okay, that's great. Can we make it organic? And he goes, no. And so we went and figured out how to make it organic, and we cracked that code. It's not obvious. And then partnered up with the biggest IP biotech law firm globally and started building out ART. And since instead of going straight to market, we started R&D development and patent development on every single method that you can make it certified organic. And that's what we focused on, to be like the Intel Inside with a clean and safe delivery. Because when you go to nanoscale, it's really important that you're not putting anything that's synthetic into the bloodstream. So one of the common methods that you'll see, there's a few suppliers that's either going to be synthetic petroleum or synthetic PEG, and then which are really the worst in terms of safety profile. And then you'll have liposomal with a modified lecithin, still a hepatic stressor to the body. The body does not like synthetically, stuff that we tweak, it doesn't like. And you put it into nanoscale, you're sneaking it past the filter system, and then the body starts stressing out and pulls it out. And it's substantially less toxic than the petroleum derivatives, which bioaccumulate. Short-term use, any expert in pegylation or encapsulation technologies across the board, they know, from Stanford to global groups, that long-term use of nanosynthetic PEGs or petroleum derivatives cause bioaccumulation at a cellular level, which means they load up and they stick there, and they then break down at a cellular level actually into formaldehyde and ethylene oxide. So it's not a hard marketing pitch also from a safety standpoint. Do you want to eat nanosynthetics, right? And that's where the market is going towards. And then you want to look at the consistency of dosage. So if you need to make sure, particularly for THC, that you have consistent dose, because if you go off base, you can have someone laying down in a hallway for hours when they thought they were just going to have a nice little buzz, right? And CBD, it's important, it really is important, but it's not life-threatening, nor is THC in reality. It just feels like you're dead, but you're not. We actually figured out the antidote to THC intoxication, so we can get you sober in 5 minutes, but that's a different talk. Yep, so consistency is really vital. So you want to make sure that you're using a delivery system or process that has consistent, again, third-party batch results. So when you're getting a source, get that tested, right? And then validate it. And then also you want to have something that stays consistent in homogenization, where it won't separate out and then change. So that's where winterized is popular, because if you use a crude in a fat-based product, it will separate and change, and then the concentration can go hot, i.e. if it gets pulled from a shelf, it separates out. The THC content can go above 0.3, and now you've got an issue from a regulatory standpoint, a legal standpoint. So winterizing keeps it a little bit more homogeneous, which is where people like that. Now with our process, we can take a full crude and keep it completely homogenized ad infinitum, essentially, for years, without it separating out. So different methods and maintaining stability and consistency, and then safety, which we talked on. Yep. Great. So we partner and power different programs from cocktails in hotels to tonic bars to drinks and beverages and Michelin chefs. We really set ourselves up to be the gold standard, and we are for efficacy, bioavailability, and safety and scalability. So, yep, you can put in coffee, you can put in drinks, smoothies, and Michelin meals. Cool. I'd love to get questions and answers.
Thank you. So I wanted to throw one at you real quick, which is a lot of people talk about adding different terpenes back in.
Yes.
From other plants in edibles and drinkables. Can the effects be made up properly?
Awesome question. Yeah, so yes, and it's complicated. So there are a lot of companies providing isolated individual terpenes, right, which is linalool or limonene. So for example, linalool will cause more of an anti-anxiety, relaxing, sedative property, whereas limonene is what provides, with cannabinoids, digestive as well as cerebral energy. Now, the plants, if you're using an essential oil extract, nature does a phenomenally better job at balancing the ratios of these compounds versus when we isolate them and try and put them back together. So it's much less effective if it's just a single isolate terpene versus the spectrum of terpenes. Now, we need to do more data and research on taking individual terpenes, copying what is present in ratios in a particular cannabis strain, and then reconstituting. I don't think, there's multiple issues with what's called spin for left-handed ligand, right-handed ligand. There's different spins, and if you start tweaking with that from a lab perspective, it's not going to be like nature does, but we need to study that more. There tends to be more issues when you go that route. But yeah, you can totally, now, from a functional perspective though, terpenes are not, so cannabinoids, if you eat a fat-based CBD, full spectrum, isolate is one compound out of 418, close to 420, but not quite. But it's like the trumpet section. It's got a lot of buzz around it versus this entire symphony orchestra with the trumpet section included, which includes the terpenes and other cannabinoids. And actually the man who discovered the endocannabinoid system he tested both. He tested isolate without any terpenes, just CBD molecule by itself versus the full spectrum. And he found that full spectrum is vastly more efficacious. And he called it the entourage effect because you've got direct agonism and indirect agonism. You've got a cascade of effects that our bodies have actually adapted to eating indirectly and directly through growing hemp ubiquitously across the planet for millennia versus when we just started isolating it and it's much less effective. Now with a fat-based CBD, 90% of that's destroyed when you eat it before it can get into the blood because it's fat. And so the first pass digestion process is very inefficient with high CBD, low THC. Now with THC, the first pass digestion turns it into what's called delta 11, which is much more psychoactive, and that's why edibles hit people way harder than smoking, because it's not delta 9. But for CBD, it just destroys most of it. So if you eat 20 milligrams, you put it in a food product, your body's only absorbing 2. Now, the most up-to-date data shows anywhere between 250 to 500 milligrams of a full spectrum is required to properly engage the endocannabinoid system. Anything below that is going to be very limited in its window, and a lot of it's going to be placebo. So the terpenes are even less bioavailable. than cannabinoids. So if you eat them, it doesn't do anything. So if you look, you don't have you can see marketing from like an indica brownie or a sativa brownie. In reality, a brownie is going to hit like a brownie, right? The terpenes don't get in the blood. They're even less efficacious from edible. The way to get it into the system is through inhalation. And so when you drink something or eat something, you're actually, when you're tasting it, you're pulling those terpenes up through the olfactory system, and it crosses blood-brain right there, and then it deploys through the hypothalamus, and they go their way. With a liposomal formulation, it takes 15 minutes for it to diffuse out, and the timing doesn't sync up. Fat-based, timing doesn't sync up. Colloidal, it's got to be the right nanometer width, but colloidal gets in immediately, and then the terpenes get in immediately, and they do sync up. So yes, and it's complicated.
Thank you for that concise answer, Will.
That works, Matt.
I think we got a couple other questions for you. Let's try and do the elided version.
Right on.
Thank you. That was kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So I actually, you just caught me on the last
More
one.
CBD.
Yeah. Right. The first question I had, which I want to make sure I'm clarifying what you said. As we're ingesting nanoparticles, you said that potentially using them from a petroleum-based product,
yep,
i.e. ethanol from an extraction standpoint, could be ultimately toxic?
Oh, petroleum, petroleum would be very rare. I mean, it would be a plant-based ethanol. I'm talking about from a surfactant perspective. So for instance, polyethylene glycol. It's made from fly ash waste, which is ethylene glycol or oxide, which is antifreeze, right? And then there's multiple chains of that. And actually, so a good example is Miralax. Miralax is PEG, and they're getting hit with a huge lawsuit for poisoning kids with symptoms like antifreeze poisoning. Now, that's at macro scale. It's a big chain, and it's not meant to get into the blood. The reason it's safe is because the body rejects it entirely because we've tweaked it and it's synthetic. And so it just never enters the bloodstream. Now with kids, they have these permeable guts, just a little bit going into the bloodstream. This is where the lawsuit's coming from, there's danger. Now when you take it to nanoscale, you're sneaking it past the gatekeeper, and it's not only getting into the blood, but it's getting into the cellular tissue. But an ethanol extract, now if they're not using, there's different types of ethanols that they could use. Some people are using isopropyl ethanol, and if they don't purge that properly, you can have issues, right? But if you're using a food-grade ethanol and you don't purge it, as long as it's clean, you'll be fine. Now, the labs that you want to use, they'll detect it because they have very sensitive detection. So you'll see other compounds even from wiping down the equipment, and that's where they have the safety thresholds. Yo.
We have I think he has a follow-up, too.
Perfect.
Yeah. And the last thing was, you had said that from an ingestion in edibles, or in this case, beverage, CBD ingestion, you said you're only going to get an effect with 250 milligrams. The body's not going to see an effect unless you have 250 milligrams? I
said that it won't get a proper effect. So the proper engagement of the endocannabinoid system versus, now it's still going to be an antioxidant, right? It's not, that property won't change. You'll have some TRVP1 targeting, which is what's called the vanilloid receptor or the capsicum receptor. And that will help with pain, but at that level, the data indicates that predominantly that's placebo. So now I'll give you an example. We've been consuming cannabis plants for millennia, right? Hunter-gatherer probably were, we just don't have evidence of this, but 10,000 BC, that's when you see it documented. The Scythians took it from the Chinese, brought it anywhere they colonized, brought it to the Romans. The Romans brought it everywhere they colonized. They brought it to the Brits. The Brits brought it everywhere they colonized. They brought it to America. It was actually already in the Americas from the Nordics and Chinese. But it was ubiquitously planted, right? And it was, when you plant something in an agricultural society, you feed it to the chickens and the cows and whatever you're growing. So Boulder did a study, and they're going to release this pretty soon, I think. But they had hemp-fed chickens that was fed hemp flour, and it turned out that the cannabinoid content of these eggs turned out to be up to 1% ubiquitously spread throughout the egg of CBD. So we're talking about 1,000 milligrams plus per egg that all of our ancestors ate for millennia, right? We artificially cut it out of the diet in the 40s. We have mass endocannabinoid deficiency of a nutrient, but that's the threshold levels that people were eating. Now it's fat-based, so but that's what we're talking about here. So yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, Will, on commercially producing with cannabis, and you just explained a couple things that could happen in the process. What are some of the sanitation prevention things that are being done to not increase the cross-contamination problems that were displayed on the screen earlier?
Can you specify from a growing perspective or
Well,
extraction?
just like if you were making a beverage, for example.
Yeah.
What are some of the things sanitation-wise that are done both pre-process and post-process before you run another product?
Right.
And how long can you run consistently without creating micro issues?
So you want to run it to ISO, right, and GMP. There are people doing that, and there are people who are not. So microbial issues can, if you put it if you don't have good practice and you put it in an aqueous solution without a preservative or method to preserve it, you're going to see growth very, very rapidly. Now, the mycotoxins are everywhere. So you can have, so isolate, right, is taken from really poorly grown hemp, but it's grown at scale. And you've got microbial, you've got mold, you've got all these issues. But by the time it gets to the finished product, the issues are not the mold, it's actually the solvents that they're using, like the hexane. And then when you nanosize that to get it into solution, now you're nanosizing those solvents that are residual. But if you do it to pharmaceutical standard for an isolate, you can get it clean. And for... Yeah, so there's multiple, basically treat it as any other vegetable that you would put at scale. And there are groups who can do it. We can crank out 30,000 gallons a day. Or GMP, FDA inspected, certified organic facility. We can do 1 billion beverages a month with supply chain locked already on that. And that's where you really got to validate and do your due diligence. We're working as an industry to have a third-party seal of approval that says it's done through compliance. And that just got launched at Ojai.
Ladies and gentlemen, Will Kleidon.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, man. He'll be here to talk for a while, and I think you'll be at BevNet too, right?
Yep.
Yep.